Hi, welcome everyone. So this is the third in a series of 4 conversations, courageous conversations on the theme of hope in the time of collapse. And the arc of the conversation, so Lana and I have been hosting these conversations, and we started with the 2 loops model, which is a framework for trying to locate ourselves when everything around us is falling apart. And so we provided that framework in the hope that would allow us each to think about what is it in this time of kind of this critical time for humanity. What do we want to birth, and what do we want to help to die gracefully? So that was the starting conversation. And then the next 3 conversations follow an arc from the systemic level to the personal level. The last time we had Skeena Rathor talking about the overall systemic approach and what's happening. And this month, we have Michelle Holliday with us, who has been working on thriving organizations for kind of decades now. And what I love about Michelle is that she was in the field of regeneration and thrivability way before a lot of the rest of us. and now everybody is catching up. So I think it's good I'm really excited to have a conversation with Michelle today about that. So we're looking at the organizational level this time, and then next time we're moving on to the personal level. So what does regeneration and thrivability mean at the personal level, and how do we contribute personally to this kind of very critical time for humanity? So that's the flow of the sessions. What we wanted to do was just give you a chance to quickly check in, and then I'm going to hand over to Lana and Michelle to hold the conversation about thriving organizations. So as a way of checking in, we were wondering if you just wanted to open the chat and just write a very short reaction to these pictures that you see in front of you. So if you can pick which of these sheep you think most accurately reflects the way you're feeling right now, and write the number in the chat, and you can put a word to it if you feel like it needs a little bit more explanation, or you can just write in the number of how you're feeling right now. We thought this would just be a fun way to get us all into a sense of how are we today. Great, I can see people are already in there with their thoughts.
Yeah, I can see John's smiling. So one way to check in is with
Good.
this heat scale.
Yeah. And sheep jokes are, of course, allowed. So,
I'm gonna stop sharing.
okay. So maybe your head is feeling a little woolly, or maybe you're feeling a little sheepish today, or that's all I've got. Sorry. Okay. All right. So I'm going to hand over to Lana, and Lana can pick up the conversation from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. It's so wonderful to be seeing familiar faces that we've been having conversations for the past, 2 courageous conversations now. And today I've met Michelle and Chris in the course that Michelle facilitated. And one of the things that really excited me about bringing in Michelle is the work that she has been doing with regards to thrivability. And I just want to share some words that she's shared in the age of thrivability, wherein she really emphasized that humanity is at a fork in the road. And we have in one direction the struggle, the division, and the despair. And in the other, we have the wisdom, the compassion, and the thriving. So, how do we get into more of that second path? What is that invitation to the second path? And this is what Michelle will be sharing with us for today. So, I'd like to start it off with Michelle. Michelle, how did you get into this? A little bit more about you, and what are
Mm,
you noticing that is shifting in the way that we view the world?
Okay. First, hi. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all. Chris and Lana, it's especially wonderful to see the two of you. And remember our 12 weeks together in that course. And I love the premise of this group, of the larger organization. This is such an important initiative to find ways for businesses and leaders to be more globally responsible. And I, within that, really appreciate the invitation into courageous conversations. I think that's at the heart of the shift that's needed. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the great question already. So I have an image that sort of helps to depict my journey and how I came to be thinking and talking about thrivability. My career has had several phases. I have an undergraduate degree in Russian studies and a master's degree with a focus on international marketing. And so I moved to Russia and I did international marketing. I worked for these two big multinational companies there in brand strategy. And that's where I started to notice that the way we think about engaging customers and community was very disillusioning to me. I felt that there must be more and more responsibility, really, to how we engage with those outside the organization. And I also noticed that internally, there was fierce competition more than collaboration. And that just confused me. I didn't understand why it should be that way. And so I left marketing and moved into organizational development. And that felt somewhat better. But I noticed that organizational leaders often had a similar kind of superficial and manipulative attitude towards employees. And so I thought there's something missing in how we think about that relationship and the responsibility as leaders we have towards those who work with us and for us. And that's when I started to see that the world is guided by a paradigm, a worldview that says everything operates like a machine. That's why we have those approaches to engaging customers and community and to engaging employees. And my sense was there must be more to the story. There must also be life and the ability to thrive that we can cultivate in our organizations and communities. So that was 20 years ago. This was just in 2000 that I turned to independent research to understand where did we get that mechanistic story? What if there's also life? And what does that mean? And what does it mean for anything that's alive to thrive? What does it take for something that's alive to thrive? And do we find those principles in our organizations as well? And we do. And so I wrote my book, and based on what I was noticing, that there is a shift taking place in that overarching worldview. And then I added, starting in 2007, this practice of the art of hosting, which is on the surface facilitation methods, but really it's hosting what's alive. The philosophy behind it is hosting what's alive and supporting emergence and supporting the fertile conditions for life to be able to thrive. So that's my journey. And it's been 20 years, but I'm noticing that in the past 5 years, that conversation has become more and more accepted and present and active. And in the past 2, it's just skyrocketed. The pandemic has really shaken us, has shaken the belief in that mechanistic story that it is the only way. And now we're starting to see that another story, another whole way of approaching organizations, business, and life are needed. And yet there's still lots of work to do. This is some of how my work shows up that's a little skippy here. I work less and less with individual organizations and more often with sectors now. So I work in national and regional tourism organizations with their stakeholder ecosystems and shifting from a mechanistic way of approaching them to a living systems approach. So we shift the language, we shift the actions. I work with groups of farmers in the transition to regenerative agriculture. I work with the field of organizational development, exploring how it can be more in alignment with life. So these are exciting shifts that I'm noticing. And let me just skip to here. Here's a sign that more work is needed. And then I'll go back to you, Lana, but I wanted to share this one in particular. This is from 2 years ago, just at the beginning of the pandemic. I invited an MBA class to imagine an MBA program designed by a robot. That was very easy. We had no trouble with that. I then invited them to imagine it designed playfully, creatively by a 5-year-old. Really hard. And then as if it were designed by Mother Nature. Absolutely impossible, completely stumped them. So there's work to be done. As much as there's lots of progress and openness everywhere I look, there's still work to be done.
Michelle, maybe you can give us an example of what's a mechanistic worldview that you've been seeing in organizations, and an example also of how did one organization that you've worked with shift that?
Sure. So that the mechanistic worldview generally is the one that tells us we are separate from each other, we're separate from nature, we're separate from our organizations, that we are human resources along with other commodities to be entered into the machine and spit out the other end to a passively waiting customer who is also separate from the organization. And nature and community don't even factor into that story of what an organization is. The story tells us that we exist to compete and consume, and that profit and productivity are the only things that matter, and that scale and efficiency are the best ways to get there, really the only valid and viable ways to get there. So this is a story that shapes every aspect of our lives. It shapes education. It shapes how we understand that tourism, the visitor and hospitality sector, in which we are seen to be props on a production line. And the goal is to shake as much money loose from the visitors' pockets as possible. And that's all. And it shapes healthcare, it shapes agriculture, it shapes the language that we use, that we refer to people as human resources. So there's a shift as we recognize that there has to be more. And let me think about tourism, for example. As we recognize that approach where it's just about more tourists and getting more money from them, that is killing our communities. It's destroying the culture that attracts people in the first place. It's destroying the ecosystems that attract people. It's destroying the quality of life. And so it's difficult as local residents to live in Venice or in Barcelona. And so people are leaving. And so the conversation within the tourism sector is that the sector is losing its social license to operate in some pretty tangible ways. So the conversation is shifting from a focus on only increasing revenue and volume of people to delivering net benefit to communities. And that even still sounds a little bit mechanistic. We're starting to have conversations about what does that mean, net benefit? And really it comes down to flourishing and thriving and cultivating the ability for life to thrive for residents, for the people who live there, for the community as a whole ecosystem, for the ecology, and for the visitors, and maybe even in some way for the world. So it comes down to a shift in conversation, and that leads to a shift in methods and interactions as well. Is that enough?
Yes. And I'm curious, how do you see this then within the education field and within the learning, learning organizations?
I see it the same way I see it in every sector, really, that it comes down to a shift in intention and therefore practice and conversation. And I think I'll share another image. This word thrivability is distinct from the word thriving is possibly an end state, a goal. And when we focus on that end state, we can dismiss it as some utopia that we'll never get to, or that is out of reach. I'm just trying to survive and you want me to thrive? Come on. Or I haven't mastered sustainability yet. How can you invite me to think about thriving? But the ability to thrive is something we can begin to cultivate immediately. So I want to point that out to explain why the word thrivability, it has importance and meaning. And I think of it as the informed intention and practice of enabling life to thrive. And I think this could be a useful guide for business schools or for any sector. Is this the real purpose of our work, to be in the informed intention and practice of enabling life to thrive through our activities, through what we teach? And I think we know intuitively what thriving means. This is my definition, that it's about enabling all life within the system to express its unique potential. So students and faculty and administration and community that is served. So at each of those levels, how can the ability to express unique potential be supported, and to generate new possibilities, to regenerate continuously, to integrate death and renewal? The mechanistic story tells us that death is failure, that endings are failure. But in living systems, we know that there are endings, and there is learning from them, and there's compost and regeneration. And there is place and there's context. In the mechanistic story, place and community have no role to a machine. But when we recognize life, then we also bring in the context of society, as I see is the trend in your activity. So this focus on enabling, on not only that end state, but how do we support life's own ability to thrive? How do we participate in life's ability to thrive? And it's not something that we can manage and control, but we can support and cultivate in a practice, an ongoing practice of stewardship. And it's an individual and a collective practice. I think of it as the practice of deepening in wisdom and compassion, and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So this is maybe at the essence of that responsible leadership, to be responsive to life's ability to thrive. And so there's a new paying attention, really paying attention to possibly new and different things. And all of it maybe starts with a new intention, that the intention extends to enabling life to thrive. And I find that we have to name that and be really explicit about it. Otherwise, we'll continue on as we do now, in which the intention of all of our activity, including and especially business, the intention is something far less than life's ability to thrive. And as a result, we're getting something catastrophically less than life's ability to thrive. So we need to name it, and we need to get informed. And I take my information, my inspiration from patterns of living systems, and there's indigenous wisdom, and there's your own sense and interpretation. But I think in here is where I think education can take some inspiration and guidance to attend to each of these aspects of this practice of thrivability.
Thank you, Michelle. And let's get to be on the practical side, because those are, I can easily picture it. I feel warm, and I this is, I long for this. It's a nice picture to hold. Yet the question is, how can we attend to this now? What are the ways in which organizations, schools, universities, institutions can practice thrivability?
I think my answer is the same. It always comes back to coming together in courageous and creative conversation to check in. Are we aligned around this intention of aligning with life? Are we clear and bold enough? I'm thinking about a client organization, a regional tourism organization that announced to the world that they were going to, from now on, do regenerative tourism. And then they realized they didn't know what that meant, how to do that. And so they hired me to work with them to develop a people and culture strategy to support them in doing regenerative tourism. And part of my advice and guidance to them was that there's no straight line from announcing we will be regenerative, that to having that strategy announced and having a straight line from that to action. There's only a straight line from that strategy to learning. So that's good news for those in the profession of supporting learning. But there's this kind of impatience. How do we do it? Get to learning, get to being in these meaningful and courageous conversations and asking bigger, bolder questions that are rooted in life's, what I think of as life's universal design principles. And I can share those, what they are, Lana. Let you decide if there's enough time for those, but that's my answer.
Maybe we can get into the life design principles, because then we can also look into, as we get into breakout, where people find themselves in this life design principles.
Donna, I like your point. Yeah. And that there's also the lens of decision making and seeing systems. These conversations that I'm talking about, it sounds light, but within them is this lens of decision making and seeing systems. It's our way of sensing the system that we're part of and systems that we're part of together. I think the only way to do that is in conversation with each other, with our stakeholders, and in some ways it's in conversation with the ecosystems that we're part of. I use the word very broadly, conversation. And in those conversations, it's a practice of discernment and decision-making about whether we are tending to support life's ability to thrive through our actions or not. And if not, what will we adjust? Absolutely. There's this sensing and discernment and decision-making within those learning conversations. So Lana, where would you like me to go next?
Yeah, so let's dive into the principles.
Okay. All right. These, what I think of as life's universal design principles there's just 4 of them. They're intuitive. You will understand them. I'll share them really quickly and then just give a very simple example of how they show up in our lives. Yeah. And this is a set of principles I've been working with for over 20 years. And I find it powerful and simple, and yet it holds a lot of wonderful complexity. So the first thing that we need to understand about thriving living systems is that there are diverse parts. And the more diversity we can invite and cultivate, the more the system is likely to be able to thrive. And we know this, right? The second thing we need to know is that the parts are supported and connected in patterns and structures of relationship and flow. And this is maybe the greatest focus of business school education. How do we support the flow of money and resources? And the more open and free flowing, the more likely the living system is to be able to thrive. The third thing we need to know is that the parts come together in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic we're after with living systems, with organizations, that more becomes possible. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And in human communities, what enables that is shared purpose, shared story, and shared identity. And here's where we depart from the mechanistic story. What powers this process, what enables the magic of parts in relationship and wholeness and emergence of new possibility, is life. It's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. So any living system, anything that's alive, any organization and community is inherently self-organizing, self-integrating, integrating parts into wholeness, self-generating, self-regenerating. We can participate in life, and we are part of that self-organizing, that we don't control and manage everything to good effect. But we can cultivate these fertile conditions. So the just simple example of how they show up is in an inspired conversation. If we bring diverse perspectives to the conversation, and if we have good flow and trust and protocols of taking turns in our patterns of relationship, and if we come together in conversation about something that really matters, if the purpose of our conversation is something that is meaningful to all of us, and if no one tries to choreograph and control too much, but we allow ourselves to follow the flow of inspiration, then we will have an inspired and creative conversation, and we'll come up with ideas that nobody arrived with, and we'll surprise ourselves with our own genius. I hope everybody has had that experience where you think to yourself, wow, where did that come from? That was pretty good. And that's the feeling that we want in our organizations, in our communities, that we can be in that participation and flow with life as often as possible. So I'm just going to skip ahead here. Oops. To the questions and the learning that we can focus on then as we cultivate those fertile conditions, that the continual sensing of our system and discernment and decision making is, how are we sharing our individual gifts and contributions, and how well are we nourished in the process currently? And what more is possible? What could we cultivate to enable more sharing and more nourishment for the people within the project? And how are we doing on flow? What would connect us and support us in flow and creativity and learning even more? And here's where we get to some really big and bolder questions about purpose. If that intention is to enable life to thrive, then we need to ask bigger questions about purpose and be in service of the wisdom and wholeness and healing that are needed in the world, that call to us, that call us together in convergent purpose, even as we invite our divergent gifts. And finally, how are we doing on aligning with and supporting life's self-organizing nature? Are we constricting, or are we inviting inspiration? So maybe the last thing is, here's how I imagine it all coming together. I hope that goes forward. It's stuck on my screen. There we go. That it's one whole system. The mechanistic story would tell us really the trunk is the organization, and that's it. And people are separate. That purpose of serving customers is that it's outside of us, but we're inviting customers and community in to be part of our system. We're inviting ourselves to be part of that larger system. And we ground ourselves in place, in context, all held by a stance and a steward and a role and practice of stewardship. So that's the principles that I see in the world, and that I see it as possible to cultivate in our organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I think we deserve to breathe in and take it in, absorb it. I know we've been having a lot of conversations around these practices, and of course, your book, The Age of Thrivability, has opened doors into this inquiry. Chris, are we ready to get people for our breakout rooms?
Yes, we are. I've set up breakout rooms, and there will be between 4 and 5 people in each breakout room. And we'll give you 20 minutes to explore your reactions to what Michelle has said. And I know that whatever happens in breakout rooms is whatever happens, that people will dive into wherever they want to. And there was so much in that conversation that you might want to jump into. So there was the thing about the shift from a mechanistic to a living systems perspective. There was the thing about what would an MBA look like if it was designed by a 5-year-old or by Mother Nature. That might be what's piqued your interest. Or there may be, I love that thing, there's no straight line to the goal, there's only a straight line to learning. I love that. Oh, okay. So it may be it's like that, what are you learning is the thing that you want to be exploring in the breakout room. And then there were also those questions, those on the 4 design principles. So what would your organization be like if everyone in it was sharing their gifts more fully? Maybe you feel like you're already there. Maybe you feel like you're in an organization where people are encouraged to share their gifts. And what is it about that organization that allows that? And then that the systems, and then the one about relationships, and how to build your networks both in and outside of your organization. But then the one that kind of really captured me was the system at the level of the whole, the one about healing. So it's as we move into this kind of turbulence and the potential for collapse, what is it that you feel drawn to heal? What is it that your organization may need to heal, either internally or in its specific context? So I guess you're going to want to jump in wherever you want to jump in those breakout groups. But those are just a few thoughts of where you might want to dive in. Yeah, John.
Chris, my apologies. I was also setting up breakout rooms in parallel. I've just sent you a text message. So,
do you want to do it then? You can press
if you don't mind, because I've had it set up, and I happen to know that we've got a number of people from same organization, so I just wanted to ensure that we distribute it.
Oh, okay. Great. Perfect. Okay, great.
Thanks.
So if you hate the people in the room with you, it's John's fault.
It's my fault. Okay. It's my fault. But what I will do is I will ensure that participants can return to the main session at any time and pick another room.
20 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
That'd be great. Okay, and I hope you enjoyed the discussions. Yeah.
So we have lost 1 or 2 from our small groups. I said goodbye to them as they were checking out. But we've also gained Wendy at Babson and Aditya at Athena. So it's wonderful to have you both here as well for the closing 30 minutes. Okay, great. Chris, Lana, back to you.
Not enough time, Chris. Not enough time.
Not enough time. There's never enough time in the breakout groups, is there? Sorry. Okay, but that leaves us about half an hour to finish off. So we were just interested in your thoughts coming back in out of those discussion groups. What stood out for you in the discussions? I'm wondering in particular where you're noticing the changes happening, what you're seeing that is being birthed, what you're seeing that is dying, whether it's dying gracefully or not, where you're seeing the hope. So any reflections within that kind of a realm?
The key thing for me that I'm very excited about is I'm experiencing finally places where there's more collaboration between generations. There is, in this city, there's a lot of ageism and there's a lot of gender stuff, and it's just boring. So we're not going to get to the bigger issues if we keep tinkering around with that kind of stuff. So it's really exciting to, first of all, have access to a global group, but secondly, to work with people that are way younger than I am. And in that, we find a real mix of how can we pull this off with everyone working and focusing on a big goal that none of us could do individually. So I'm excited by that.
Thank you. Other perspectives? Oh, Brad, yeah. Brad's been very good. He's raised his hand, and I almost missed it. But
silently raised.
That's a good idea. So if you can find the way to raise your hand, that brings you to the top of the screen. So go ahead, Brad.
Oh, thanks, Chris. I was just going to quickly comment on the wonderful conversation that we had. We got into a conversation about birth-death, or death-birth, and gracefully exiting a dying system and birthing a new one. And we talked about healing, and it's interesting that there's a perspective of healing sometimes as fixing something, and that it's like sustainability's kind of gone off track a bit today too by trying to sort of fix a broken system. And we talked about actually the need for more of, Donna used the word transmutation, which I really liked. Like an octopus, obviously, that grows a new arm, or you get a cut on your arm and a scab heals over and there's new skin growing, and so the healing is part of growth. And so there's a need for us to, I think, move toward this regenerative future, and by enabling that will help also heal us, as opposed to trying to go backwards and fix something. So I like that a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other reflections?
Perhaps share a question from our group, which I think guided much of our conversation. So, Chris, we have not come to your questions, but maybe, and that's something that Michelle might, given her experience, that she would like to respond to. If I can pick 3 scenarios that we've discussed, out of which I think there comes a common question. I live in the country that's known for being the most unequal country in the world, which is South Africa. We have just come from the pandemic, and so Lana shared from her side, living in the Netherlands, but coming from the Philippines and being in an alien country at a time of deep crisis, where what she was used to and the relationships that gave her comfort and protection and nurture were actually absent. And I think then also, having been confronted with Alexander in the same conversation, living in the Ukraine, at a point where one of the world's focal points at this point in time is, from a war and crisis perspective, one can ask the same question. So the common question perhaps is, how do you discover thrivability and nurture thrivability in the context of crisis, or in the context of disparity and inequality, and so on? And lots of our conversation then focused on the power of relationships, but I will just leave it there. Maybe just let the question hang for a while.
Yeah, Michelle, would you like to come back on that? Yeah, please.
Yeah. It's a wonderful question. And I think it connects to some conversation we had in our group as well. A question that came up in our group was, do you really want so much diversity? Because that can lead to conflict, and it takes a lot of time. And so my response to that, and I think to your question as well, is that we can't isolate these design principles and take them one at a time. It's a whole living system. And that practice of stewardship, of tending to the fertile conditions, is tending to all of them and how they interact, how they relate to each other, so that when there is a conflict, then that's an invitation. It's a calling to respond to it, to take that into account as part of our key part of our context. And in our response, then to explore what is the diversity that will serve us in our response to that conflict. I wrote an article not long ago in which I said, if we're really honest, if we really pay attention to the science, if not the whole geopolitical context as well, then we'll recognize that we need every sector, every industry to lay down their tools, pause, look around at the world and say, these are our skills and resources. How can we help? So I think in some ways, the conflicts and the challenges that you're describing are life's call to us to be in the practice of thrivability. We can't afford not to anymore. This is the moment. Life's ability to thrive is so much under threat. We have to respond. And the way to do that is in ways that are aligned with life, to practice thrivability in our response to the world's call for more thrivability. And another thought, another response is that I sometimes show a picture of a woman underwater holding a cup, and our corporate social responsibility initiatives sometimes act as if that cup of water is separate somehow from the ocean that we're within, but it's a microcosm. So as we tend to the conditions for thrivability within our organizations, then we're serving the thrivability of the world as well. I see you've raised your hand. Arnold, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think Anders has something maybe to say on this as well. So Arnie, if you go first, and then I'll bring in Anders, and then we'll see who else would like to contribute.
Yeah, it's a short input because I would just like to connect again with thrivability, diversity, the focus on diversity, and the rediscovery of the life within. Isn't that exactly the problem with politics? Because it's driven by ideology, and ideology smothers diversity, and it smothers thrivability. So we're living in a world where countries are largely being governed by ideologies that actually suppresses the possibility of creating the kind of thriving that we talk about. So our focus this afternoon is on a subsystem. It's on education, it's on management, it's on companies, and so forth. And those kind of responsibilities, and of course, there's a lot of potential in there. But mostly we look, especially since 2015, 2016, just post the SDGs, we are looking into a world and historic developments that have been driven by self-interested political ideologies. And how do you talk about thrivability in a world where this is the case? I think this is smothering the potential that we do have.
I completely agree. And the mechanistic story is a reductionist story that tells us we're just in it for ourselves. And so we're in this battle of worldviews. Exactly.
Thank you.
Anders.
Yeah, and I was part of a discussion yesterday which dealt with thriving as well. And a few questions. I think it's fundamental that one thinks about and wonders about what is thriving to me. Where do I see it? Am I able to see it? And if I do see that, the thriving, what does it mean to me? And that's the me level where I guess we're going to go in the next courageous conversation. That if you have some sort of sense of where you see thriving, you can move on to the we, to us, to here and now in this context. And how can I then build on the thriving that I see in that context in that organizational or whatever context it is, but the larger than me, the group or whatever. And then comes the final sort of level, all of us, for all of us. What does it mean for all of us? So beyond just my context. And we talked about language and the importance of language in the group that I was. And it's interesting to think about if there could be a universal language which actually could talk about thriving and have a sense about what it is, which goes across boundaries. I don't know how it will and whatever happened, because that would speak to our humanity immediately then. It would break the languages, the barriers of having the English here and my Swedish or whatever it is. But I think it starts with being able to identify what thriving is from your heart and from the one you are and how you live. And from that, put aside everything else. Leave your brain for a while even. Just get a feel of where do you thrive and what is it? Okay, we'll stop.
Beautiful. It's so helpful to have a moment in nature to reconnect with our own thriving, our own potential for thriving.
Yep.
Are there other reflections?
Yes, I was just going to pick up from Anders because I was in the group as well. And I think what you've just triggered in me is when we talked about the language and finding the common understanding of it, one of the tools then is conversation. Milenko brought that up about the importance of conversation. And that's part of the learning. And that's part of the only line that's straight. And it becomes part of the informed intention. So it's informed by the conversation and by the relationships. We wondered about, has anything really begun to shift? So it brings me to the thought of, if thrivability is a word that we agree is an important one, and we're looking for examples of it from the smallest level, from the individual, what do you feel about it? What's in your heart? Then that's the basis of the conversation that will form the relationship, that will build the mass, that will move things forward. So I love the whole systems approach, but I really love seeing those parts, those four showing up continuously. And maybe that's the place to start within organizations. If there is even an ideology of an organization, it's talking about this, but not doing much. If then the conversations were started around what is it, what informs it, what is it to you, wherever you are, what does it mean to you? That's how it grows. If we continue thinking about the growth of organisms. So that sounds not a straight line, so that fits. And it sounds too easy, which makes me automatically suspicious. But I think that's what you've come to there. What is thrivability? What does it mean to you? I think that's the seed. In fact, I won't use the word germ. I just use the word germ. Germinate. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about the crisis, that's what germs do, is replicate themselves and spread. So if we could start a virus of thrivability.
Propagate. Yeah.
Okay, better.
I'm just noticing in myself, when I listen to Anders and when I've listened to you, Kathleen, about what is it in me? If I start with what is it in me that feels like thriving, I notice in myself a voice or a sensation that says that I'm not allowed to have those things. That those things are somehow childish or insubstantial or frivolous. And I wonder if that's and then I extrapolate that everybody else must feel something a little bit like that. And then I wonder if that's part of what we're facing here. And maybe that's something that we might touch on next time when we get to the personal level. But I'm just tracking that in myself.
And Chris, I write about that in my book, that part of the work is to come to believe that we're worthy of thriving. I encounter that consistently over the years, less and less, but there's this resistance to thriving. I don't deserve it. I haven't worked hard enough. Or that's something frivolous. I just need to be productive. That's all that matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also have a perspective on it that the thriving for yourself is something that is related to others.
Yeah.
Yes. There is no thriving in isolation.
Exactly. And then you can speak it out and you can act it out.
Exactly.
Lana, I want. Oh, sorry. Yes, please do.
I like the way that Anders and Kathleen summarized also discussion from our group, but I would like to mention something that was not in the group, but somehow I would like. There is a book I will show you. Maybe you have read it, by James Cars, The Finite and Infinite Games. I think it highly resonates with the idea of thrivability that Michelle launched here, and discovering your own unique genius, because each of us has internal genius. The potential is there. Now, what is the difference between the finite and infinite games? The finite games, there are many differences, but one of them is that finite games are played within certain limits. And there is a winner and there is a loser there. Infinite games are played with the limits. And this is what thriving is. Destroying the limits, because there are no limits. If we all thrive, then the horizons just go further away or up or distance. So I think this might be the secret to make people feel safe rather than having fear as they feel now. Mostly they are feared. They need to feel free. It's an open game, and the purpose of the game is not to make it to an end. On the contrary, the purpose of the game is to continue playing the game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a very indigenous perspective, that the work is to continue the culture, to enrich the culture for future generations.
Yes.
It's an infinite game. Life is an infinite game.
So just the book or what Francis Fukuyama wrote, The End of History. This is, by the title, it is disaster. There is no end. There is no end. And later on, he apologized somehow. He wrote another article where he said, okay, maybe instead of ideology, we will have culture as a driving force, for not only for competition, but also for collaboration.
Thank you. So we're coming towards the end of our time. Lana, I wondered whether you had a question or a reflection, and then we can give Michelle the final thought, I think.
I would love to give Michelle the final provocation. What are you leaving us with as a place to explore or experiment?
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This has been really wonderful. I want to offer two related thoughts. One is touching in on this fear and curiosity. Donna, I really like that you're noticing there's the flip side of each other. And how scary is it to be in a world in which you are isolated on your own in competition with everyone and never worthy of thriving, but always only measured by your output and productivity? That's a fearful worldview. And in contrast, a worldview of thrivability, of our deep participation in life says that we are not alone and that our thriving is tied up with the thriving of the world, that we can be in relationship and we're worthy of thriving. So that's a very curiosity-driven worldview where we're always curious to discover the potential that we bring and that others bring and that we can manifest together. So I love that pairing of fear and curiosity. So the other thing I want to offer is when I look at things that business schools are adding in response to this call for globally responsible leadership, I would encourage the deepening of the conversation. If we are adding a program, and you all know this, but just to say it, if we are adding the SDGs onto a worldview that is still mechanistic, then we'll just be perpetuating harm in those spheres, in those areas, and we will remain fragmented most of all. So we can't separate the attention to diversity from the attention to the water or from attention to the land, anything. So I would encourage all of us to have these deeper conversations about what does it take for me to thrive? And how could our work together as a business school support that? As an organization, even before we look to what we want to teach, how are we living out this practice of thrivability? And be in that learning and curiosity among yourselves, and then explore with students and other stakeholders within your system. But the worldview is profound. It's a bigger shift than we might imagine. And it's not a debate, exactly. It's not a debate. That means battle, right? Curiosity is the key. And I think that's it.
Thank you. All right, I think we're about to wrap up. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Michelle for her part in the conversation, for all the thought-provoking and heartwarming things, mind-opening things that she's contributed. Thank you to Lana for holding the conversation. A big thank you to John and the GRLI for hosting this session and this series. And thank you to everyone for showing up and being part of this and bringing yourselves and bringing the institutions that are behind you and just bringing your openness to this and your curiosity and your will to this kind of critical time that we're in humanity at the moment. It feels good to be in this together. So thank you all for being part of that. And I'd love to encourage you all to come back in a month. So the next Courageous Conversation is on the 20th of July, where we'll be looking more deeply into the personal side of this, how things are playing out at the personal level. And I'm looking forward to that because something has clicked today for me that hadn't maybe clicked before. I think there'll be more things to discover next time on that.
And Chris, before we wrap up, just in the chat, what are you living with? A word or a sentence?
Yeah, great. Let's do that. And I think some people may hang around. I think the room can stay open for a bit. John, is that right? Yeah, if people want to just kind of...
the room's open.
Yeah. All right, great. So leave us all with a parting thought, and then if you need to move on, then move on. If you'd like to stay, then feel free to stay a bit longer. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We're the ones staying on.